I am Hilary Rochon. I am the Politics, Press, and Public Affairs Officer at the British Consulate General in San Francisco, and I also manage the Marshall Scholarship for our consulate. And I have organized this Marshall's Virtual Summit so that as many people as possible can learn about scholarship, what it means, what its intentions are, and the impact it's had on the people who've done it. I do want to start off with an acknowledgement of the death of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, last Friday. The UK government is in a period of mourning as we reflect on his death and the impact he's had on the world. Most external engagements for the UK government have been cancelled as a result or postponed, and we decided to go ahead with this summit because of the Duke's particular passion for international collegiality, for higher education, for people and making self-betterment, and for a life of service and doing something for someone other than yourself. And we thought this was actually maybe a good way to mark that. So we will have that in the back of our minds today. What is the Marshall Scholarship? So the Marshall Scholarship is a thank you from the British people to Americans for the Marshall Plan, which enabled economic recovery in the wake of World War II. So there have been Marshall Scholars going back to 1953, and there have always been scholars who were female, and we're quite proud of that fact. There were 8 of the 50 scholars were women in 1953. And considering this panel is focused on diversity, particularly with regards to women and the LGBTQ plus community, I think that's an important thing to note. I do just want to tell everyone that this session is being recorded for your information, which also means that this and all the other panels in the summit will be available at a later date if you have to run to class or anything else. So I do want to preface this with a little disclaimer that while we have chosen to discuss the experience of women and people who identify as LGBT+, we do not equate them or envision them to be the same, but we are just having both of those conversations now. So I'm going to start off by letting our panelists introduce themselves, what they have done since the Marshall, why they chose to apply to be a Marshall, and what that experience has meant to them. Does anyone want to start us off? Jesse?
Hi. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
You are unmuted. Go for it.
Okay, that's dangerous. I'm Jesse White. I am undoubtedly the oldest person on the panel. In fact, I went to England to take up my Marshall in 1966. So the scholarship actually wasn't that old when I became a Marshall. In fact, back then there were only 24. And I'm from Mississippi, grew up in Mississippi, went to Ole Miss and lucked up and got this Marshall, which of course changed my life and for the better. Certainly gave me expanded horizons. After the Marshall, came back and I taught for a couple of years. Well, I got a master's degree in international relations at Sussex. Came back and taught at Ole Miss for a couple of years, and then went to MIT where I got my doctorate in political science. And my career has basically been in government, nonprofit management. I was worked for the United States Senate. I was an appointee of President Clinton to head up an agency called the Appalachian Regional Commission, and headed up a think tank on economic development issues for Southern governors, and ended my career here at UNC Chapel Hill, where I was an adjunct professor in the School of Government. And set up an Office of Economic and Business Development to create a better interface between the university and the community economic development needs in the state. I was not out at Sussex. Very few people were. 1966, 68 was really before the gay rights movement had much visibility at all. And in fact, it took me quite a long time to come out, another 10 or 15 years. When I finally did come out, I kicked the door off its hinges, and have been very active in the LGBT movement ever since. In fact, I was the first openly gay person to head a federal agency, the Appalachian Regional Commission. And after I was a founder, one of the founders of what's now Equality North Carolina, which is our LGBT PAC, political action committee that's had a lot of success. Had to resign that, of course, when I went with the federal government. But then after my term there, I was on the board of the Victory Fund and went back on the board of Equality, and had been very active in the LGBT movement. So I came to this after the Marshall. I can't really shed much light on what it was like to be gay in the mid 60s in England. My guess is it probably wasn't the best thing in the world. In fact, it wasn't most places in the world at that point. But I think the Marshall, gave me a good solid education, orientation toward the world, and the self-confidence to come out when I finally did. And I've had the privilege of being on some selection committees here at UNC, and I was just thrilled to see openly LGBT people applying for the Marshall and doing very well in the application process. So that's my story in a nutshell, and I'm sticking with it. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Who'd like to follow that? Meg, maybe? Oh, sorry, Clark, if you're keen, don't let me stop you.
Well, no, it is kind of funny. I'm a law school professor, and I teach a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and consult on that. And so I was unsure whether it would be better to have me sort of follow up and talk about what it was like to be gay decades later, or whether it would be better to be more inclusive and have a woman speak. So I think actually I'm going to let Meg speak, if that's okay.
That's fine. I was going to wave you in. I liked the start of your intro. Well, yeah, I'm happy to introduce myself and to take questions. My name is Meg Towell. I am a 2007 Marshall. I applied to the Chicago region. I grew up in the Midwest. I studied international public health at Liverpool for my first year and at LSE for my second. I went on to work in international health at the World Health Organization and with some governments abroad, then pivoted into technology and now do a little bit of both, where I tend to work with organizations in healthcare and education, think about how they use their data and communicate it clearly to people. So I love participating in things like this because the Marshall was just this surprising, wonderful change to my life trajectory. I applied sort of by accident and certainly never thought I would get it, and have just met some of the dearest friends of my life as a result. Had a wonderful learning experience, certainly living in another country. I'm happy to speak to all of the rest of that, and since have participated in some of the regional selection committees, and so that's always interesting to be on the other side of things, and have just been really inspired and excited about the students that I see applying these days. People have such rich and wonderful stories and are incredibly motivated to do good things in the world. And I know the Marshall will be a really great platform for people to do that. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm happy to continue the conversation in a bit.
Okay, so now I feel comfortable speaking. So, let me see. I can't say enough good things about the Marshall Scholarship. It was probably the 2 best years of my entire life, by far. I have letters that I wrote to my mom. I was up at University College at Oxford, and I wrote to my mom nearly every day. And I still have those letters. And I wrote to her almost every day, just like yesterday. Every moment of the day was as perfect as it could be. There was no place that I'd rather be or anything else I'd rather be doing. It was just such a magical time, partly because Oxford is such a physically beautiful place, and partly because I was there 86 to 88. And from the moment we touched down, let's see, I'd been an undergrad at Harvard, and then I was staying with my parents in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and flew up to DC for the consulate where all the Marshall scholars met each other, and we flew over together. And it's just like, I just have never had any experience like that in my entire life before, since suddenly you're thrown in with all of these people who were all very interesting and kind of different. There were people who were super extroverted. There was a son of a senator. There was somebody else who went on to become this famous musician. There's somebody else who went on to, oh, sorry, she was a Rhodes Scholar we met over there. But anyway, it was a really great group of people. And then in London, we all like hung out for a couple of days for this orientation. And it was such a magical beginning, and that was really terrific. And through the 2 years, we also would have Thanksgiving at my friend Sam's. His family was from London, though I guess they were living in London. He's from the United States originally. So all of us would be there for Thanksgiving. It was just a wonderful community. So I'd say that was one thing. The second thing sort of related to that, the ideas quality, just being able to talk to so many interesting and uncertain dimensions, diverse people. So like a lot of American universities, there wasn't, in retrospect, a lot of class diversity. And like a lot of probably worse than American universities, my friends who were women at the time had mostly imperfect experiences. So all of them discussed feeling not treated equally. And in retrospect, there was a lot of unusual class bias that was sometimes invisible to me as somebody who had gone to an elite American school from a pretty good family, as they judge families there. I didn't really notice it. I wasn't treated badly. I did notice, sort of in terms of what Jess was saying, like what was it like to be gay? It was really a transitional moment. I think I was out to my friends in college, and I wouldn't necessarily have been out, except that there was another Marshall scholar, and we were in my, what was it? I guess apartment-like thing at the college. And he said, oh, what are your goals? Or what do you want to accomplish out of these 2 years? And I said, well, I'd like to write a screenplay, which by the way, I did. There's lots of free time. Second, what was the second? Oh, to get a first in PPE. I don't know where I came up with that idea. If you do PPE, don't set that as your goal. Third, to fall in love. And without pausing, Mike said to me, well, I don't want to write a screenplay. I'm doing this graduate degree in philosophy, and I don't think I'll fall in love because I'm gay. And it was the first time in my entire life that anybody actually said those words. Like everyone else, it had been sort of like danced around with this kind of like little trial balloons, like commenting on some other guy's appearance or something. The words, I believe no one had ever said those words in my presence before. And so the room started spinning and my vision started getting dark and I felt nauseous and I started to lean forward. And then the last thing I remember was him saying, are you okay? And I looked up and I said, oh yeah, I'm fine. And I was just on the verge of passing out. It would have been such a bad experience for both of us. And that's what it felt like for those 2 years, in the sense that it was wonderful and exciting, but it was a little precarious. There were a couple of other openly gay Marshall scholars. My second year there, I went to the Oxford Gay Valentine's Party and fell in love with somebody who went on to become head of a gaming company of all things. And it was when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister, and I don't really quite understand how it worked within the politics at the time, why this was such a big deal, but why they would make this an initiative. But they passed a law, Clause 28, I think, that rescinded the ability of local governments like the City of London to have gay rights laws. And there was a big march. And it was both horrible because this had happened, but great because there were so many people there, sort of like going to certain political events a couple of years ago. Horrible things that happened, great, there were other people there. So that was one thing I thought coming out was much easier there than in the States, although until my second year, I didn't realize there was like an official group. The other thing that was really interesting was being exposed to so many ideas that didn't map on to the American academic experience. So like Jesse, I was a political science and also history major. And it just turned out that a lot of my tutors in philosophy had perspectives that were not mapped onto the American experience, at least as I had had it. So there was a critical scholar, Steve Lukes, who was this blind scholar who, it's so nice. He's like a very famous at the time, and he had a theory of power that was kind of vaguely Marxist maybe, or Marxist Hegelian informed. And I'd never looked at the world that way. And the other experience that I would just leave you with is that really captures the beauty of it academically, socially, and intellectually, was that we have these 6-week vacations there, and they'd give us books that they'd suggest we read. So in the winter of, what would this be, 1987, I was in Venice. I went with some friends from high school for the first weekend. They left, and I stayed in Venice for 5 days, alternating between reading, oh my goodness, Plato's Republic, which is one of the greatest experiences of my life, and also Death in Venice, which was really just a horrible book in retrospect. No one should read that book when they're coming out. It's a very depressing book. And then I met some friends from Oxford who I did a lot of drama with, and we plays and stuff. And so we traveled around, and it was wonderful. And it remains this day a source of so many friends. And as a measure of the friendship, I was in London 2 years ago in Hampstead, and somebody yells, Clark Freshman. And I turned and I thought, Paul Golden? And I hadn't seen Paul in like 30 something years, but he was a director and I had been in some of his plays. And we went back to his house, and I was a documentary filmmaker, and we stayed in touch. So it was just great. It was a fantastic experience. I feel so lucky that I got to go, and I'm so grateful. It's sometimes said that the UK and the States have a special relationship, and that's definitely true for me. I didn't have that special relationship in advance, really, but it was so formative, and so whatever money was spent on me was well spent. By the way, I guess I forgot to say what I do professionally. I'm a law school professor in San Francisco at UC Hastings, and I study kind of interesting things, I think. So in addition to the diversity, I study primarily negotiation, and my subspecialty within that is how to sort truth from false statements, or how to detect lies as one subset of that. And I also do work on mindfulness and other types of meditation and how they relate to negotiation. So it's really sensational. I feel so lucky that I'm here. And just to let you know the power of the Marshall, I remember being at Harvard, I did really well. And I asked to be I met with the pre-law advisor and said, like, I'd like to be a law school professor. And she said, oh, that's ridiculous. Don't go to law school for that. Nobody can do that. And my husband's Todd Rakoff. He's a famous law school professor. I'm like, okay. So discouragedly, I went off trying to figure out what to do. Then I win the Marshall Scholarship, which back then, at least, I think still makes the front page of the Harvard Crimson, all the people who won. And she calls me up and says, can you come over for dinner sometime this week? My husband wants to meet you. He meets me, and he says, before I say anything else, let me just say this changes everything. Now you'll become a law school professor. And sure enough, that really was the case. Within the world of legal academics, I think Justice Breyer was a Marshall as well, it carries a lot of cachet. So apart from the experience and education, that was great too. So thank you so much. I didn't catch your name because I got here a little bit late looking for cufflinks. So British Consulate, San Francisco, whatever your real name is. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm Hillary.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Thank you, Hillary. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and thanks.
No, I appreciate that. And I really think, especially given the thrust of this conversation, the personal story that people can connect to and realize that, of course, it's amazing to be a trailblazer and be the first, but to know that you don't have to be the first, to know that, I think, to your point of meeting another Marshall who was also gay, that, you know, you weren't alone, I think can be so inspiring for people to realize that shouldn't be the reason you don't do something. And that all of us have something in common in that way. But in particular for diversity issues where you're already labeled as a minority and you certainly feel less than those around, not less as a person, but that there are fewer of you than the other people in the room. I think it's really helpful to know that we all have it in mind, that we all share those stories, that maybe we change the narrative of the way it was. And in the interest of balance, I'm going to pivot back to Meg on specifically talking about being a woman in your field, being in that field both in the US and the UK. And if there was a difference, if you've seen growth over time since you were there as a Marshall, what change you would like to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I might have had a unique experience in the UK because my fields tend to be pretty female dominated. So in one of my courses, I'd say a couple things. One is I was in 2 one-year programs. Both were very international. So there were, in one course, I think there were only 2 people from the UK, and another, there were none. So I think that that's a pretty unique course experience. And in many of my courses, or my cohorts, it was almost entirely women, which I think I think in retrospect, I would have wanted to know a little bit more about who's usually coming into the course. And so I think that is something in reflection that I might have done a little bit differently going into them, because I knew they would be very international, but I didn't know beyond that. I think things have really evolved. I know a couple of years after I had left the UK, there was concern among the Marshall alumni because there were not very many women in the class that had been admitted that year. And I know the Alumni Association and the consulates and many others that are a part of this great Marshall ecosystem have really, like took it on very quickly and recognized that this is something that we want to change and the alumni want to be a part of it. And so I think 10, 15 years later, these conversations and all sorts of outreach efforts and other initiatives that are happening have really made inroads there. And so reflecting on my experience the past few years of being part of the New York selection committee, I know there are many times where it's such a rich group of people that are applying, and I think I really appreciate that the Marshall organization and larger community really took this on very aggressively and wanted to make it front and center and be really thoughtful about it. I know that's I did not apply to the Rhodes because I thought it was bananas that they didn't let women in, even though that was many years ago. So once I read that, I was like, yeah, that's just not part of the organization I want to be a part of. So that's part of what drew me to the Marshall, that history. So I'm like glad that you mentioned that at the beginning. But yeah, that's my reflection. I don't know if I really answered your question about differences between today. I think I just had such a unique experience being a woman in courses and programs that were led by women and particularly geared towards women in some ways.
No, I absolutely appreciate it. Appreciate that. And then I really like what you said about, well, essentially the Marshall community being essentially so active. I think that's clear by all the volunteers we've had for this summit and people who are so keen to see anyone who is passionate about wanting to become a Marshall have the tools they need to do it. And in terms of like change over time, obviously we've all lived through quite a year in many ways, particularly for the advancement of civil rights and people fighting for equality in a lot of different ways. So for any of you really, what changes are you happy to see? What changes are we still nowhere where is there work to be done? And how does higher education and the Marshall Scholarship have a place in that? What can we do? What are we doing already? What should we do more of? No, it was a lot of questions. You can pick one.
Well, you know, I think is where there's more awareness of different types. Let me rephrase this. I think that there's a split that has always been true within movements for equality in the United States and worldwide between a kind of expansionist idea of equality and inclusion and a more narrow focus. So, you know, as an academic researcher, it turns out that the greatest degree of prejudice is often for people who are just inside the in-group. So light-skinned African Americans have twice the income of dark-skinned African Americans. Light-skinned African Americans have the worst opinions of dark-skinned African Americans. Reform Jews have the worst opinions of Orthodox Jews. Fraternity pledges have the worst opinions of rival fraternities, and the same is true for sororities, I believe. Though I'm actually, let me rephrase that. There's not research on sororities, so it might not work the same way. And untenured professors who are about to get tenure have the worst opinions of students compared to tenured professors. So this is kind of a phenomenon where I see, I remember as a gay person, somebody identifies as gay male, I remember in, what year would this be? 1995, the first openly gay law school professor in the country said to me, you know, it's never adequately been explained to me, those are his exact words, never adequately been explained to me why we should be concerned with transgender people. And I thought, wow, that is so interesting. It had never crossed my mind like at that point. But that is something that I think we see here, including, you know, having lived in Miami a long time. And as we know from the last election, right, some people were startled how the Hispanic vote, by the way, I'm saying Hispanic advisedly. So in South Florida, partly because of this assimilationist tendency, Cubans and Argentinians prefer to be called Hispanic rather than Latino, because Hispanic sounds more European. So I think that's, you know, that's kind of the frontier, which is both sort of a group dynamic frontier and an individual frontier. So as individuals, so I just started using, and I forgot, I thought it was automatically here. I use my pronouns when I sort of sign into Zoom. It should go in automatically. And it's just interesting to see what happens if one models things. So I tried 2 years ago, I said to all of my students, in all written work, when you first use a pronoun such as he, him, or they, drop a footnote and explain how you're using pronouns throughout your paper. Like, are you just always using he? Are you always using she? Are you alternating? Are you going by what you think the person identifies as? And I was surprised I didn't get any pushback. Now, I do live in liberal San Francisco, and I'm at a liberal law school, but I did not get any pushback from that explicitly. Everybody abided by that. And the following year, I guess that's this year, I just changed it to either use the pronoun they or use no pronouns. Do not use a gendered pronoun under any circumstances. And again, I was kind of surprised that there wasn't any pushback with that. And having said all of that, there's a famous law school professor, is a colleague of mine. He's only famous within a very small field. So it's not actually, like, nobody here, unless you're in his field of law, would know who he was. Even if you were a law school professor, you would probably not know. But he imagines himself to be very famous, and in some ways he is. And he misgendered a student. The student said, please call me something. He said, no, that's grammatically incorrect. And the person said, no, Webster's actually includes, I didn't know this, by the way, Webster's includes they as the plural. And the professor said, well, I'm not doing that. That's ridiculous. Well, I found out about this because all these students in my negotiation class were talking about it. And then it turned out that the dean of the school, who's gay, wanted to, quote unquote, mediate, like have the people talk to each other and explain their situation. And the student said, and I'm so proud of the student said, there's nothing to mediate. Like, this violates the law. By the way, it wasn't clear at the time it violated the law. Now it's clear. So this violates the law. You have to tell him not to do this and explain why. And so good news, bad news. So the professor did change, and the professor did privately apologize, but it was never discussed in class. And so it remains to this day like a legendary incident that embodies both narrowly the problem of inclusion of people who identify in different ways vis-a-vis gender, and also the problem of the broader problem of the lack of transparency of how we deal with these issues and whether things are up for debate or not. So I think that's I'm sort of curious what people think, like, at their own schools. Like, I think that's the frontier. I think another frontier is there are people who have the point of view that they are victims if they are conservative. If they are conservative, they will be criticized for being conservative. So that is another sort of point of view. I don't particularly understand. Like, I understand why wouldn't people want to, like, claim that they're being victimized. Like, I get that, but to me it's nonsensical. It's like when people stand up and say things. So Justice Kennedy's son, Greg Kennedy, went to law school with me, and Greg Kennedy stood up and said, whenever somebody black speaks, I always discount what they say because I know they got in under a lesser standard. And this black woman stood up in our class and said, well, Greg, whenever you speak, people know that you only got in under a lesser standard because your father's a Supreme Court justice. And what's more, he only got in because he's an old white man that's totally inoffensive. So I think it's a great question. I think it's a great question, Hillary. I'd be really curious, what people find. And that's very interesting. And I think, as people who go to England, I felt like in some teeny tiny way, Mike and I are the two openly gay scholars. We sort of made a difference in our little ponds or little Japanese gardens, whatever they were, whatever the metaphor is. And so I think that's great. And I know some people have their like pronouns here, which is really great. I think that makes a difference too.
Yeah, in North Carolina, we're not quite yet ready to deal with cutting edge issues. We're sort of dealing with fundamental. I mean, I'm joking, there's a spectrum, of course, but we do have some basic fights here between North Carolina is the two faces of Janus, if there's any state. I mean, there's Chapel Hill and the university towns, which consist of about 10 counties in the state. And then you got the rest of the state. And it was epitomized when our two United States senators were Terry Sanford and Jesse Helms. And so this legislature that we've had as a result of gerrymandering and other things has been very hostile to LGBT rights. Everybody remembers House Bill 2, which was an abomination. And now they're up to passing another one that deals with transgender issues and sports and all sorts of things. And so, we're fighting some basic battles here. I think the movement of history is going to be fairly clear on this, but we've dealt with the marriage amendment, we've dealt with HB2. It's been one thing after another, and so one thing that is heartening is in the organizations that I'm involved with, transgender people are fully at the table. And so I think that is beginning to change, but it's a slow process, and we got a lot of work left to do. And I got to say, Clark, I also have every letter I wrote my parents and that they wrote me for those 2 years. And I've been writing my memoirs, and it's 50 years ago, but I'm reliving my years at Sussex. And other than the first couple of months when I was morbidly homesick, once I got over that, they were two of the best years of my life. And we didn't fly over together. We sailed over together on the old on the old Queen Mary. Really dating myself. But it was a life-altering 2 years. It absolutely changed my life. And I only applied because my advisor at Ole Miss encouraged me to. I applied for the Fulbright, and she said, well, there's this scholarship called the Marshall Scholarship. Very few people had heard of it at that time. And so I applied, and we had our regional interviews then in New Orleans. And one of the interviewees, I think it was over 2 days, went out on Bourbon Street the night before and showed up a little hungover, and he actually got a Marshall. So, the Marshall is inclusive of hangover people as well as all sorts of other people.
I'm not going to recommend the applicants the night before your interview. I'm just going to put that out there. But you do you. Because being a Marshall and the Marshall Scholarship is emblematic of this bilateral relationship between the US and the UK. What do you think should be the posture of that leadership in terms of diversity? What can the UK and the US be doing more together? What does the Marshall mean to that relationship to you?
Well, I will say I was, so relatively recently, there was a royal pardon. So a regular pardon is kind of routine. A royal pardon is very rare, and a royal pardon erases the original conviction. And the Crown, to whatever the political process is, but in the Crown's name, there was a royal pardon given to Alan Turing, who was the person who really prevented Hitler's destruction of the entire world. We all owe him an incredible debt. He was the code breaker, and yet was prosecuted for being gay and had to be chemically castrated, ended up killing himself. Apple computers, some people think that the emblem for Apple is a reference to Alan Turing, because it's as if there's a bite in the apple from when he killed himself. So it's interesting. I saw the play about Alan Turing that was it was a sensational play in London. I think it was with this actor, Derek Jacobi. It was a great play. And then but it was very depressing to know that that was the situation. And I will say that at the time, was he there then? So at a certain point during my first year at Oxford, I forgot this part. I don't know if you covered this when you were there, Jesse. I can't remember the exact years, but there was the Commission on Decriminalizing what they called homosexuality at the time. And way ahead of the United States, it was decriminalized. But we studied that debate in our PPE course, as some tutors covered it. And the person who took the right side of the debate, H.L.A. Hart, was the professor of jurisprudence at UNIV before that. But then the person who was on the wrong side of the debate, I think, like to this day, later on became sort of succeeded in his chair. So it was a little bit weird that it was an open debate. So a little bit strange that way. But now the UK seems to have gone further, right? And so that's terrific. And it would be great if the United States did something quite similar. It'd be great if President Biden issued a similar pardon, which he's capable of doing. So many people were discharged from the State Department and other government agencies, either for being gay or being alleged to being gay. Ironically, under the impetus of Roy Cohn, who was Senator McCarthy's counsel and sort of lawyer for Donald Trump, had his hands in a lot of bad pots. And so it would be nice. I mean, that would be a great precedent. It would be a great precedent and a great tribute to the UK, using that as an example for President Biden to say that he grants a pardon to all people who are convicted and restores their rights.
Yeah, there's a very good book dealing with a lot of that called The Deviant's War. And it's basically about Frank Kameny, but it deals with the whole thing during Eisenhower and a guy at Harvard wrote it. I'm blanking on his name right now, but it's called The Deviant's War. And, you know, regarding touring, I thought the movie was quite good as well.
Oh, the movie's sensational. Yeah, the movie's sensational. But the play, oh, I found it just here. It's wonder how Amazon works. Yeah. Yeah, I also would say that, you know, when I was applying for the Marshall Scholarship, this event never would have happened. This event never would have happened. There wouldn't have been this much attention. You know, it's two things that really are related. They're not identical, but they are related. You know, a lot of the mistreatment of women in societies because is the devaluing of things that are associated with women or feminine, thought to be feminine stereotypes. And the same is true for the treatment of a lot of gay men and a lot of lesbians and bisexuals. And so there is some, you know, kind of overlap to these issues, even though they are also distinct. It's about the role of limited expectations of how people should act based on their biological sex. That's not the whole thing. There's a whole set of patriarchal laws which are completely independent of that, and there are a whole set of sort of religious based in the United States and other cultural taboos against gay men and lesbians and bisexuals that are transgender people that are not overlapping. But I think it's just worth saying that I could see why people might take offense at lumping two together, because like why is there not enough? Why must there not even be a single panel on women? Why must it be shared with someone else? So I can really appreciate that, and I hope Hillary didn't get too much pushback on that. But I actually really like the way this has been combined. I noticed, by the way, there is a question here about racial and ethnic diversity and equity. I would say my experience at Oxford when I was there was that was positive, very positive in two senses. So I don't know how many there were there 30, were there 40, whatever number of scholars there were, several of them were people of color. And there was, I just learned about, the screenplay that I wrote was about South Africa and the first Black South African woman Rhodes Scholar. So there was a lot of attention to that there. And I think, yeah, I thought that my experience there was pretty good at the university itself. And the master of our college now, University College, is a Black woman who is a labor life peer. Am I saying this right? Is that the right term? Labor life peer?
Yeah.
Yeah. She's like a baroness for life, but her children don't become baronesses, and she was nominated by the Labor Party, right, and does developmental work.
No, that's excellent. No, and thank you for being a part of the conversation. I really appreciate it. Really good question that I think is going to wrap us up time-wise in the chat. What advice do you have for discussing diversity and personal stories as pertaining to LGBTQ+ or women's experiences in the application process? And then I would think that would extend through to your interview, should that happen.
Well, I'm happy to jump. Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
Oh.
Well, just very quickly, I would say down in my part of the world, in the Deep South, people who have struggled with their sexual orientation and triumphed over it and have embraced it as a part of their life makes a very compelling story. And that should not be the alpha and omega of an application, but I would not shy away about highlighting that as a part of your life's journey.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would add to that in certain circumstances it could be a more prominent role. So there are, if someone were explaining why they want to do a project on, say, oh my goodness, where am I? I'm so blanking this. There's a lot of the best queer theory comes out of the UK. So if somebody were wanting to study there, and that was the reason why they picked a particular school, then that would be useful. And the same thing with gender. There are a lot of terrific gender scholars there, and so, as there are in the United States, and so it might be sort of more relevant there as well.
Yeah, and I'll just I'll chime in to say that in my experience in the review processes, like it's nice to remember that the reviewers are human. They are reading lots of applications during interview day. They are sitting and talking to lots of people, and stories are compelling, and people want to know you as a human being. And I think when you can do that sincerely and talk about why you as a human being have the intellectual curiosity that you do, or the questions that you do, and that's what's driving your Marshall application, and you have personal stories that have influenced that, I think people, I know the folks that are doing the reviews just really want to understand you as a person. And so I would certainly encourage you to share that when it makes sense to.
And by the way, I'll just add that there were 0 people of color in my class.
Yeah, I will say from the process I've been a part of the last few years, the Marshall organization is really thoughtful about the students that are selected. So it's about diversity in as many ways, I think, as they can think of. So they might understand that organizations like Harvard, Clark, you might have experienced this, but Harvard is a well-oiled machine, and they know how to prep candidates for applications. And so they want to talk to students that might come out of institutions that are well-oiled machines, but they also recognize that most institutions in the US aren't well-oiled machines, and we want to hear from those students as well. We've seen, there are so many life stories where people have had all sorts of personal circumstances. They have worked before they applied and can bring really rich professional experiences into the discussion. There have been people that are living on the street due to drug addiction and homelessness and are now in a Marshall interview. And so I think there is a very wide range of human experiences coming into those interviews and those applications, and that's really deeply encouraged.
Amazing. I appreciate all of that. And as someone working in a consulate, the UK government is very much committed to advocacy for diversity and supporting diverse communities. So that clearly filters through into the Marshall selection process. And I hope anyone who is applying isn't afraid to bring that to their application and in their full presentation of who they are as a potential scholar. So I'm going to ask for any final closing remarks before we wrap it up from our incredible panelists.
Go for it.
Anything you want someone applying to know or not be afraid of, or
do it, just apply. I'm sure you've heard this before, and I think any Marshall that's gone through the process would say just the process of applying is such a wonderful personal and intellectual experience to start to think about, do I want to go to graduate school and why? And to be able to articulate that to other people. There is time lost, but I think it is well spent just to go through the process, no matter what.
I would underline also as well, reaching out to like your mentors and teachers. I was just really, it was just spectacular. There was a teacher who taught, oh gosh, what was it? Psychiatry, law, and the practice of medicine. I didn't even think he knew my name. And then he spent all these hours talking to me about his experiences. And to this day, I remember things from that conversation that literally yesterday I used in my problem solving class about informed consent. Yeah. So using it as an opportunity to reach out to people is great too. Thank you so much, Hillary. Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm so, this is, I wouldn't have imagined that this event would have been possible in 1986, probably not in 1996, maybe not even in 2006. It's just so nice to hear that. And it's also nice that, although as with any country, there are political differences on certain issues, I'm glad that in the UK there has been something of consensus there that might sometimes lack in the States.
Thank you. My pleasure, genuinely. Jesse, anything to leave us with?
Pardon?
Oh, just anything to leave applicants with. Final send off.
Just go for it and good luck, and don't let anything stand in your way from applying. I mean, you just look at how far we've come on the issue of racial diversity in the scholarship. Like I say, back when I went, there were no Black people. And now there's a pretty good representation, is my understanding.
Yeah. On that note, we do have another diversity panel in the summit tomorrow that will start us off at 9:30 Pacific, 12:30 Eastern. That is specific to race and the Marshall Scholarship. So it sounds like a lot of you might really enjoy that conversation as well. You're more than welcome to come to that. Links are on Twitter. And then for those of you putting in a couple of application questions, there's also an application Q&A tomorrow. So please bring those questions there, and there will be expert panelists to answer those too. If you want to apply, please get in touch with your fellowship advisor or your local consulate. That can be local to where you live or where your university is. And with that, I just want to thank our panelists so much for their stories and answering all of my questions, and for all of you for watching. Genuinely couldn't have happened without all of you. And